Good morning, I'm Sally Pointer and I'm out hedge bothering as usual. Now this morning, in a fit of enthusiasm, I set a challenge on the Nettles for Textiles Facebook page. How long a piece of sewing thread can you make out of one single nettle? So I suppose I should put my money where my mouth is and take this as an opportunity to process one nettle start to finish entirely on camera without a lot of the cutting away and coming back again that I usually did. I'll speed things up a bit to make it less boring, but let's see how it goes. First thing, I need to pick some nettles. So what I need for a really nice long piece of thread is a really nice long nettle, and this one looks quite promising. Now yes, I'm wearing gloves. I am probably ruining my street cred or hedge cred maybe, but I did so many nettles last week with bare hands, I really upset my skin. So I'm having a couple of days of covering up. That one looks good. I'm going to trace that down as far as I possibly can go. I'm going to actually pick 2 or 3 just to have a bit of choice. But what I'm looking for is a long nettle with very few side branches. So, second turn time, we'll see what we get. Well, I picked 7 nettles in the end, but I reckon those are looking very promising. Probably one of these first 2. Look, we've got nice straight stems. Certainly that one close to the secateurs has got good long joints between the nodes, long sections between the nodes. Not too branched. Goes up quite a long way, bit of bindweed around the top, I'll sort that out later. So I'm going to take the leaves off here, leave them in the hedge to go back into the soil. I'll take the stalks home and then I'll pick the one that's going to be our string experiment. So these were picked maybe 20 minutes ago. I've had time to get home, make a cup of tea and not drink very much of it yet. I think this is the nettle I'm going to go with. It's a little bit over an L long maybe. We'll measure it properly once I've got the bark off it. And I'm going to keep it simple today. I'm going to beat the stalk. Please don't tell my husband I'm using his better rolling pin. I never get much fibre off the very tops, but I always feel I ought to try. Okay. And then I'm going to split it in half. There we are. So we've got the pithy bit in the middle, bark on the outside, and then I'm just going to peel off the internal core. Now, if I'm lucky and I can get it started nicely, this might all come off in one fairly good strip. We've had quite a lot of rain over the last few days, and that usually does make the nettles peel a bit more easily. You always have to be a little bit careful when you get to the joints, so there's a leaf joint coming up there. Oh, it's not a leaf joint really, it's a node, isn't it? There we go. If you can get past it, then you can usually keep going without needing to do a lot more snapping off. If it starts snagging at any point, there's a bit there, I'm not sure if I'm leaving some behind or not. I might snap a bit more just to make sure that it's all coming, because I'm only using one nettle for this challenge. I want as much value out of it as I can possibly get, so I don't want to leave much bark behind. Normally when I'm processing, I'm not that nickety. I'm using lots and lots of nettles, so if one has a bit that gets left, that really doesn't worry me. Nearly done. There we are, at the very top. There's still a bit of nettle left there, but the fibres are quite delicate at that point. I'm not getting anything worth having. So this is my nettle for the experiment. Now I'm going to scrape it ever so lightly. I've measured my nettle and it's approximately 45 inches, 115 centimetres long, but that includes the really, really fine bits at the tip, so whether I'll get much out of those. So I want to leave quite a lot of the bark on this, but I'm just going to scrape it just a tiny bit. So I'm using my favourite old-fashioned table knife. It's thin, it's flexible, it's blunt. You'll often see me waving this around in ways that you shouldn't with a sharp knife. And all I'm really going to do, let's try and angle this so you can see, is very slightly scrape the surface. I'm more bruising it than anything, but I want to pay particular attention to those joints. If I can take the lumpy bumpy bits of those out, that will help in the next stage. So I'm just going to work down this. I'm starting with the outside and I'm supporting it quite well. I don't want to grip it too hard, it's hard on the hands apart from anything else. So I'm just clamping it with one hand, slightly scraping with the other, not really trying to remove too much, just bruising the outer layer. You can see it's just a bit of green coming off. And when I get to those joints, just a little bit more attention there, because if I can smooth those out, I'll be able to get finer strands later. I used to scrape nettles quite a lot, but I'm definitely coming around to the idea that sometimes you don't need to scrape all that much. Just by crushing some of those green cells in the outer layer, you can really remove a lot of the bark when you dry rub them in a bit. So I'm working quite slowly because, again, this is a stunt piece, if you like. Yeah, we want this to be as productive as possible. Normally I work a little bit faster. But it's still only going to take a minute or two to work down the entire length of this. I'm taking a moment at each stage just to make sure everything's flat and even, because I want to scrape this evenly. The whole point of a sewing thread exercise is even thread. If you were actually going to sew with it, you don't want snaggy bits. It's got to be really uniform. So it's a good opportunity to test your favourite processing method. Oops, you can't see through my arm there, can you? And see what really works to give you the most consistent results. Nearly there. I'm just getting up to that slightly fine and straggly bit at the top. You do need to go quite delicately at that stage. Right, and now I'm just going to go back over the inside. So this is really quick now. It's almost the same motion you'd use if you were spreading butter. I'm sort of squeegeeing out moisture as well as taking off a very, very thin layer of the green cells. And more importantly, and I can see some just there, if I've got any barky bits, any, well, core bits more than bark, any of the woody sections from the inside that are still left, this will get rid of that. How did that get twisted around there? I swear this stuff is like those Mobius strips sometimes. It seems to tie itself into knots that aren't technically possible. Keep supporting that nettle. We want long, long, thin strips for this, so although I can cope with it breaking. Any bits that don't are a bonus. There's another twiggy bit there. I'm really not trying to scrape right down to white fibre in this case. Okay, so there is my scraped nettle, and you can probably see that fibres are showing through at the ends, but it's really not about scraping down to absolute pure fibre. Now what I'm going to do next is separate this into ribbons, and as many even ribbons as I possibly can. Then I'm going to hang it to dry. I want this completely dry before I do the next stage. Going on there. That's those traily ends. They can be quite pesky, those traily ends, but they can be useful later. So remember, of course, this is just one nettle, and when you do shred it down like this, it's amazing how it looks like so much more material. So there we are, one nettle. Very, very slightly scraped, but only a tiny bit, broken down into preliminary ribbons. I'm going to hang this to dry. It's only going to take an hour or so, and then we can see about making our sewing thread. Well, I lied when I said it was only going to be an hour. Life got busy and complicated, as it does, and it's now 2 or 3 days later. So anyway, this is my dried nettle bast. And all I'm going to do before I start cording it up is give it a really good rub between the hands. And what this does, and you can probably see the bits coming off, is flake away the bits of dry bark that were loosened by the scraping. And if you remember, I only scraped very, very, very lightly. I really wasn't trying to remove the bark entirely from this. I just wanted to get rid of the coarser elements of it. And then this rubbing will further get rid of the loose bits and will soften the fibres just a little bit, so that when I start cording up in a moment, I should have access to really, really controllable fibres. Folding it up to increase the efficiency, but I only really want to rub this for about a minute, which is probably coming up round about now. There we are, that's a bit floppier, and hopefully that now will cord up. So what I'm going to do next is just dunk this in water very, very briefly, literally just run it under the tap, and then I'm going to let it sit for maybe 5-10 minutes so that it softens, but I don't want it soggy when I do the actual cording part. So here we go, moment of truth. This is actually almost dried out again, but hopefully you can see how fine the strands are. Now I want to do a fairly classic 2-ply cord here, and I want it to be as even as possible, so the danger areas are these nodes. So as I pick each strand, I'm just going to run a thumb over it, and if there's anything really lumpy I can get rid of, that's great. And I also want the overall thing to stay quite fine and quite even, so I'm going to overlap 2 strands so that they finish One's going to finish about there, the other one's going to trail off a little bit later. I want to be able to lay in new strands quite evenly without interfering with the thickness. And I might even need to keep licking my fingers with this because it has dried out, but that's okay, slightly dry, better than too wet. So classic laid cordage, twist away, cross down. And I'm hoping that I can equalise out these little nodes as we go. So let's see what happens. Now, a sewing thread does need quite a bit of twist on it, and sometimes with a very fine cordage it can take a moment to get the twist running the way I want. Now, I have to take particular care with the thickness on this, so if I do see a thin spot developing, I'm going to need to do something about it. But mostly we shall continue. Now, this is probably going to take a few minutes to do, so I'm going to keep the camera running full speed until I put the first join in. Then I'll do the rest of the cordage in full, because that was sort of the exercise here. I don't often do processing start to finish without taking any breaks in my videos. I'll do the rest, but I'll speed it up so that it's not too tedious to watch, and I won't be at all offended if you skip forward here and there, unless you just like watching cordage being made, in which case have a cup of tea, sit back, and maybe join in. It'd be really nice to see how other people's cordage is coming along. Now, this is actually a thicker cord coming out than I'd intended. It'll work as a sewing cord for something heavy like leather, but it's actually quite a bit thicker than I'd planned on making. But hey ho, that's all right. You learn something with every bit. Now then, that's the end of one of my pieces. I've still got two over here, so I need a new strand. Again, just running my thumbnail along it to sort out any traily bits. Now, ideally, I don't want to put too much bulk in the middle here, so I need to find a fairly thin section to join in on. And I'm going to overlay so that I get most of it, in this case, on the side that needs it, and the very thin bit on the side that's still going strong. With the thicker cordages, there's a lot more leeway to lay in more or less equally and have it balance out. But I really do want to keep this nice and even. So far so good. We've probably got 6 inches or so, and that was from the first strand. I'm going to pause and restart this so I've got a fresh video clip, and the next section will probably be a little bit faster if I can work out how to do that. Well, you know, I just said that I was going to film this in full. I don't know about you, but even I'm bored of watching me. So we've got this far. So far, it's reasonably even. I think I could probably do better. I've still got this much to go, but you know what? I think I'm going to stop the camera for a bit and I'll put it back on when I'm just a couple of minutes from the end, because You've seen enough of me twiddling string, you really have. I'll be back in a second. There'll probably be a sneaky cup of tea while I'm working on this. Okay, we're down to the very, very last few little bits now, and it's always a bit of a gamble how many of these last little bits you fit in, but I wanted to get this as long as possible, and it's all completely dried out now, so I'm having to lick every piece as it goes in just to make it flexible enough to cord. I've definitely made thinner thread in the past. I'd really hoped I was going to do a little bit better this time, but hey ho, these things are as they are. Thickness, it's reasonably even. We'll have a proper look at that right at the end. But for now, the job is just to get those last few inches out of this without losing strength if we can. So it is a case of just patching in almost frog hair like bits. Yeah, they're almost invisible on some sections. But nettle's very, very strong, and even these tiny little bits will add strength. And even though this isn't the thinnest bit of thread I've ever made, it's actually going to work fine for sewing up some leather work maybe. I've got some new Neolithic kit to make soon, so I might make a pouch and sew it all up with nettle string. That might be quite nice. It might even be suitable for a necklace, for the cord for a necklace, though it's quite a long piece and it seems a shame to cut it if I don't have to. But for now, the challenge was to take one stinging nettle, process it any way you like, and see how long a piece of thread I can get out of it. I've still got the challenge of passing it entirely through the eye of a needle. Again, the challenge said it can be quite a large needle, so that's okay. But that's mostly to check that there aren't big lumps or bumps anywhere in it that would impede its use as a sewing thread. And you can have very thick sewing threads at the end of the day. It's just a matter of personal pride that I'd hoped for something just a little bit more refined. I'm so nearly there on this. Now, you've seen a lot of nettle videos from me recently, but actually the nettle season is starting to come to an end around here. It's the 18th of August today, I think, and usually I would say I'd be picking right through to the end of August, but the ones I did this morning, the bark was starting to really stick to the woody sections, and it wasn't nearly as nice to work on as the bits I was working with a couple of weeks ago, or definitely back into July. So I think I've almost done with my harvesting for this year, certainly of nettles anyway. However, that doesn't mean there's not loads more nettle work in progress. If you've been following my prehistoric nettle videos, I'm doing some collaborative work with an experimental archaeology centre, and we're looking at wear marks on flint. So I'm processing my current batches of nettles with some flints that they've already had a look at down the microscope, and we'll compare the end results when I've finished using them, and that will be very interesting. And I'm also still talking to people all around the world about different thoughts on splicing and cording, and generally how nettles may have been handled in prehistory, as well as the more modern aspects of their use. There's plenty to keep me out of mischief, and you haven't seen the last nettle video by a long stretch. Let me just check my thickness. That's getting just a little thicker at the end. Now, have I got any more usable bits here? A couple of tiny bits there. Hardly see that one. Any last bits? Oh, so small I don't think it's really worth using, but we'll try anyway. Just in the interests of completeness. Now, what I tend to do with fine cordage, if you get to an end where there's a traily bit, is I will fold the traily bits back on themselves to keep a consistent thickness right the very end, or consistent-ish. I think that's as far as we're going to get. So I shall take this downstairs, we shall measure it, we shall see if it passes through in an eye of a needle. We'll have a quick go at wraps per inch, so seeing how thick the overall thread is, although as I said I think it's a bit chunkier than usual, and we'll also, pretty strong. Let's find out how we did. I seem to be slightly jinxed at the moment. I've already filmed this bit once and then the file corrupted, so I'm doing it again. Anyway, I've measured it. It's 172 centimetres long, and the challenge says you've got to be able to pull it right through the eye of a needle. This is a fairly big needle. I usually darn socks with this, but no problem there. It would probably go through something a little bit finer again. It's roughly 20 wraps to the inch. I've just measured that as well, and it weighs 1.09 grams. So, you know, it's quite a chunky bit of string for the size nettle it was, but that's perfectly all right. I've got to do some leather work soon. I've got some Neolithic pouches to make for my historical education work, and actually I think this will be really nice to sew up a leather pouch with. So if you stuck it out through the entire video, well done. Hope I haven't bored you too much. Have a go. It's really good to challenge yourself occasionally with a material that you think you know really well. Just keep refining it. Can you make something smooth? Can you make something even? Can you make something really long out of one single nettle? Happy hedge bothering.